and I'm going to be moderating today. And we should also have Nikolai on the line, who's going to be our discussant. Nikolai, did you want to come in?
Hi, Julie. Just to check you can hear me. Hi, everyone.
Yes, we can hear. We can hear you, Nikolai. Did you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. I just said hi. So I'm Nikolai Hutchinson. I'm the head of the governance team for Kenya, for the British High Commission in Kenya. And I was fortunate enough to be in post at the time when we commissioned much of this research, in particular on the elections, on women in politics and corruption. And yeah, I'm looking forward to showing a few observations on how this was particularly useful and relevant to us and our work in Kenya after we hear from the presenters. So thanks for having me.
Great, thanks, Nikolai. Okay, so we're going to make a start with the first presentation for today. If I could ask each of you to introduce yourselves. So Claudia, over to you for the first presentation on corruption attitudes, social norms and behaviours in East Africa.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I hope that everybody can hear me okay. There were some slides that were prepared. I think that EARF will be sharing screen with those slides. Yes, thank you so much. So my name is Claudia Vaz Camargo. I'm head of public governance at the Basel Institute on Governance, and I'm going to describe our EARF-funded research program on corruption, social norms and behaviors in East Africa. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So the objectives of this research study were basically to investigate behavioral factors influencing attitudes towards petty corruption in Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda. So specifically, we were asked to investigate whether factors linked to automatic thinking, sociality, and mental models have an impact on corruption outcomes. We had two main research activities. On the one hand, we conducted a semi-systematic literature review to understand what do we know about behavioral factors influencing corruption outcomes, and also to assess the relative effectiveness of anti-corruption interventions to tackle petty corruption. And then secondly, and very importantly, we conducted field work in Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda with the goal of exploring the feasibility of incorporating behavioral insights to develop more effective anti-corruption interventions. So if we can go to the next slide. In terms of the findings, I'm going to group them into three categories or three themes for our findings: informal networks, social norms, and stereotypes. So regarding social networks, we found very quickly that social networks are problem-solving resources to people. So in contexts where service delivery and delivery of public services is not optimal, to put it somehow, people often harness their social networks to get things done. So for example, in the context of a medical need, if one has a nurse, a doctor, as a friend, as a relative, it is often the case that one goes to this person to seek expedited treatment, especially if there's a long queue at the health facility. Similarly, another example would be having problems enrolling a child in school. If one has a teacher in one's social network, then this can also facilitate getting the enrollment done. So as we were conducting this research and learning about these practices, of course, one of the first questions that came in my mind was, so what happens if you don't have a person who can help you in your network? And I remember one of our research participants very, surprised at my question, saying, well, Claudia, of course, you build a network. And what this means, and this is really quite important because shows into the nature of the social exchange, how important it is to co-opt important and useful individuals into one's network. And this gives a special meaning to what we, from a good governance perspective, see as bribes. So a bribe or a gift or giving soda or whatever euphemism we want to use is, yes, very often about getting the problem at hand solved, but it's also about building a relationship. So an example given to us by a research participant in Uganda, he was explaining an exchange with a traffic police and how, caught in a violation, of course, there is resorting to a bribe to get out of the trouble. But he said, but you know what? At the end of the exchange, you will have probably exchanged phone numbers, exchanged contacts. And at the end, you are like brothers. So that I know that next time, if I'm in trouble with a police, I will call my friend and he will help me. So bribes are about often building social relationships going into the future. In terms of social norms, we heard a lot about norms of reciprocity. Something for something, nothing for nothing was an expression often used by participants. The obligation to do everything for the benefit of the social network. So social obligations and expectations of reciprocity and solidarity play a key role. And these shed light into some of the social pressures that public officials are often subjected to. They are expected to do everything in their power, often including exploiting access to public money or resources for the benefit of the group. Giving and receiving gifts is also, we found entails an unwritten but clear expectation of reciprocity and certain obligations. I have very fresh in my mind how some Tanzanian doctors refer to the practice of patients of offering gifts as these patients are trying to enslave us, because the gift giver thereafter feels entitled to demand prioritize or privilege access to the services. So these social norms and these social expectations have, very binding effects, in the sense that socially being seen as not abiding with these social rules results also in social costs, such as gossiping, bad-mouthing, and in some cases we heard even violence. Abiding to the social norms is also linked to social status. So we were told by, in our focus group discussions, how those who get money and share the money are loved, regardless of where the money is coming from, whereas often those who follow the laws are repudiated and disliked. So strong social pressures towards perpetuating practices of petty corruption. In terms of mental models, of course, a very common one is the expectation or the perception that everybody is doing it. So corruption is, normalized and accepted out of the belief that it's the normal behavior that everybody is engaging in. Now, we also found evidence of how behavioral elements can also promote good anti-corruption and good governance outcomes. And a lot of this evidence came from Rwanda, which, as we know, has a very strong anti-corruption framework, and which is quite strongly enforced. So one of the things we found there is that where monitoring and sanctioning of corruption is strong, the kinship networks develop or adapt in the sense of generating pressures to prevent their relatives or their friends from engaging in corruption. Why? Because the high likelihood of getting caught means that if my relative public official engaged in corruption and gets caught, for the network this entails the loss of the breadwinner. There is also a policy of public shaming associated to being caught in an act of corruption in Rwanda, which generates the kind of social cost and expectations that actually reward abstaining from engaging in corruption. So this is a taste of the findings from our research. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And I can talk about our outcomes and impact of the research. So we feel very proud that ours was one of the first research projects to deliver concrete evidence on behavioral drivers of corruption. And this we see has been part of a growing interest in the role of social norms and how they may be fueling certain patterns of corruption. We are very proud that our publications are widely quoted in this thematic area. And our research has inspired the adoption of social norms approaches in large donor-funded interventions in the region. In terms of the implications, so we think that the insights that the research brought has informed why many conventional anti-corruption approaches have limited effectiveness, and also brought to the forefront the importance of social and informal normative frameworks that might be more important to people on the ground than the formal legal frameworks. So depending on which normative stance one adopts, embezzling public funds might be corrupt, of course, from the perspective of the legal framework, but not doing so, not getting the funds to help a family and network might be seen as immoral from the perspective of the members of the social informal network. So it's very important to take into account the perspectives and the expectations of those who are involved on these transactions and these behaviors associated to petty corruption. Another interesting implication is that when we take a step back and reflect that conventional anti-corruption approaches typically look at individual incentives and shifting individual incentives to make corruption less attractive. However, in the research, we find the prevalence or the very central role of informal networks in enacting and promoting decision-making and behavior linked to corruption. So this makes a difference because when one operates in a networked environment, even if individuals are taken out or are taken away from the network, the practices and the rules of the networks live on. So what this has led us into a reflection is to ask the question, so what would anti-corruption look like if we shift the unit of analysis from individuals to networks? What would a network minded or adopting a network lens means for anti-corruption practice? So if we can go to the next slide, please. So in this regard, what we are doing at the moment, and which are really building on our EARF funded research, we have at the moment 2 research projects which are funded by the Global Integrity Anti-Corruption Evidence Program. In one, we are testing in a very concrete way the meaning or the implications of our findings by developing and we hope very soon piloting a behavioral anti-bribery intervention in the Tanzania health sector that seeks to work by harnessing existing social networks to promote behavioral and attitudinal change towards gift giving in Tanzanian health facilities. The second project is a little bit more broad in scope. We are exploring precisely this question of what it means to adopt a network perspective to develop anti-corruption interventions more generally. We are also using the findings of our project to inform other activities. I'm going to leave it at that because I think my time is over. And I look forward to questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Claudia, and thanks for trying to keep to the time as well and keeping an eye on that. That was really great. I did post in the chat, we will have questions at the end of all of the presentations, but do feel free to pop them in there as you think of them. We're just going to play another video next, so fingers crossed the quality is a bit better than the first. We've got George Bamugamarie, Deputy Inspector General of Government in Uganda, who's going to speak about the impact of the research findings from this corruption study, and also what's changed over time. So hopefully the video will play shortly.
My name is George Bamugamarie. I'm the Deputy Inspector General of Government of Uganda. I've been in this role for 8 years, and I'll actually be leaving it shortly. I got involved in this project of research on corruption, low-level corruption in Uganda a couple of years ago. We took particular interest in the research because all our inquiries indicate that the citizens of Uganda grapple with low-level corruption. So our desire was to establish the attitudes of the citizen towards low-level corruption. This research therefore came in handy because it addressed that question head on. What drives low-level corruption? The findings of the research, which was conducted in the northern part of Uganda and another part of the country, indicated that there are two types of corruption. One of them is outright bribery. The outright bribery corruption hurts the citizen. They give it grudgingly. They give it because they have no choice. This is particularly manifested when police, traffic police, and other service providers demand to be paid against the will of the citizen. But this research indicated that there is another interesting trend, that citizens sometimes pay bribes because they feel sorry for the service providers, particularly providers of essential services. This became clear in respect of health workers, sometimes cashiers and individuals whom they consider to be paid very low salaries. So this was very interesting to find that sometimes small bribes are paid to service providers as a way of supplementing the low incomes that the service providers receive. Now that was a very important finding for us. Indeed, this 2 years ago, we followed up this research with a national integrity survey. The national integrity survey indicated at 4 main sectors that solicit bribes are the general police, seconded by traffic police. And the third unit was police investigation department, and the fourth was the judiciary, courts and land tribunals. This has been a very important finding, and our country is going to draw up plans to respond and find ways of curbing corruption. We are grateful to the organization that funded this research. We are grateful to Professor Claudia from Bessel Institute and her team who conducted such an extensive research in this country. We thank you once again.
Okay, thanks, Stella, for presenting that. We're going to move on straight to the next presentation now by Karuti Kanyinga, and that's on the early warning and long-term monitoring of the 2017 Kenyan elections. Karuti, please, over to you and do introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. I hope I can be heard. Oops. I believe you can hear me. Can someone load the presentation, please? I am Karuti Kanyinga. I teach at the University of Nairobi Institute. This early and long-term monitoring of the 2017 elections was undertaken by a colleague from UK. The colleagues from included Nick Fishman, Gabriel Lynch, all who have been working a lot on Kenya's governance and politics for a long while the Kenyan colleagues included myself and a couple of others, including Mutuma Rutere, a renowned expert on security matters, and others included Collins Odote, Priska Kamunge, and Olunga Ouma. Next slide, please. The aim of this, can you move the slide, please, or should I present myself? Okay. The aim of this research project, and I think this is the most innovative part of the hub, if I can say that, is that we were supposed to do research, but then not use the research findings as an end in itself, as is often the case in many research projects. Our aim was to use those research findings to improve on electoral support and interventions, and at the same time identify potential areas of conflicts and then provide mitigation measures. Now, I'm calling this one innovative simply because it required us to be providing findings at very regular, on very regular intervals to the diplomatic community and in particular to the British High Commission so that they could identify opportunities for intervention in case there is a problem. But at the same time, we would share the findings with the other institutions in the electoral cycle management with a view to enabling them also make strategic decisions and choices in whatever they were doing. Next slide, please. Now, I'm various institutions to identify what we can call opportunities for intervention and to strengthen the electoral process in one or the other. We focus, in terms of scope, we focused on three academics and the UK. The themes included religion and religious institutions and how they would contribute to free and fair elections. We all looked also at election management and reforms, but paying particular attention to different institutions. And finally, all of us were looking at dynamics in the counties. I will specifically talk about what we as Kenyan academics were involved in, and that is institutional preparedness, and looking in particular at the role of the judiciary and what role the judiciary was specifically playing in dispute resolution and whether they were prepared or not prepared, the kind of differences that internal differences in our judiciary, and how those differences would spill over to affect electoral preparedness, if at all. At the same time, we were required to look at the counter dynamics and paying particular attention to the role of devolution in the electoral politics. Is devolution making any impact in terms of how politics is organized at the local level, or is it the same game that is played at the national level? That's one particular question we were supposed to respond to. And then at the same time, we and colleagues from UK looking at issues of electoral management, resource conflicts, and political parties organization. But all of us really were also involved in paying particular attention to the question of devolution and how devolution of power and resources was impacting on organization of party politics at the local level, what that meant for national political mobilization, if at all. Proceed on, please. Next slide, please. Yes. What are the findings then that were coming from, especially the work that we Kenyan academics were looking at in terms of institutional preparedness? Surprisingly, we found that the judiciary was the most prepared institution actor in the entire electoral process. But then, even if it was prepared, we can say, yes, it was prepared in terms of administration of the law. But then we realize, and this is an important finding, that the elections are political. They're not about laws anymore. Because disputes that come into the courts are actually an extension of disputes that are taking place outside of the courts, disputes that are taking place within the political environment. Whatever elites cannot agree with, whatever elites cannot agree on in their disputes outside there, they bring them over to the court. And sometimes because they think that there is someone else who is ready to make their hands dirty by resolving their disputes. And we could see one case mutating one form to another, especially because of this. They would not agree on how to resolve. They would not agree on how to resolve the question of the disputes. Sorry, just 1 minute, please. Sorry about that. The other thing that we found, and I think it's an interesting finding, although I've not put it on the slides here, is that we also noticed beforehand that actually our Supreme Court had divisions that were ideological in nature, and we did put this one in some of our reports, and therefore even that ruling to overturn the decision to overturn the 17 August presidential election was not coming to us as a surprise because of the radical divisions that we noticed within the court itself. And that to us was very telling. Even if many people looked at the Supreme Court as conservative, we had already marked it as an institution to watch in regard to how it would pay attention to the elections. What recommendations then do we make out of these observations with regard to the judiciary? One is that given the nature of our elections and the manner in which our laws are made the laws are usually made very late into the electoral process. We think that it's very important to start prioritizing preparedness of institutions very early in the electoral cycle. Not the judiciary alone, but all the institutions that are involved in the preparation of elections and the conduct of elections. There is need to pay attention to how well they are prepared. And that preparation needs to take very, very early from the in the early stages of the electoral cycle, and immediately after one election is concluded in particular. If we begin that way, then all institutions will be very well prepared. Because we noticed that there is no synergy in terms of how institutions are prepared. Some are more prepared than the other. The second issue related to this, and which I would really like to emphasize here, is that the judiciary was over-prepared, and therefore even IMBC itself tended to be overshadowed by what the judiciary was doing. In fact, the more the judiciary administered cases with high speed, the more it tended to disrupt what the IEBC was doing. And one may raise quite a number of issues on that. The second issue that we'd like to emphasize here is the need for all institutions involved in the electoral process to be conducting regular political economy analysis And this is not because of anything else. It's simply because the context in which they operate is highly political. There are various interests, there are various incentives, there are winners and losers that need to be marked from the very beginning, because many of them place blockages in the way the reforms are done. And finally, of course, with regard to disputes, there is a need to think very carefully about how to address political disputes. And we think strengthening of political parties disputes tribunal is very important in this respect. Let's move to the second slide, please. Yeah. We turn now to the electoral security, and this our concern here, unlike our colleagues who looked at electoral security in broader sense, our role here concerned only looking at the police. And what we would like to argue here and observe is that, yes, Kenya has a 20 constitution, and there are new laws that have been put in place, especially with regard to police reforms. But these have not impacted on the culture of police, especially in the management of street protest demonstrations during elections. The second thing is that the attitudes and the behavior of our police is still rooted in the old ways of doing things. Using excessive force to disperse crowds is a feature that has origins in the colonial period and has never been addressed in any significant way throughout or in the last close to 60 years. There have been reforms now and then, but I think we have never been able to tackle this particular phenomenon of attitude of the police. Perhaps everything has got to do with the curriculum, but that's a different story altogether. We mention this simply because, yes, the police have been trained regularly on election matters, on how to provide security during elections, but we don't think this training has spilled over to impact on how they address issues of protest and street demonstrations. And finally, we find that the political environment itself in the country did not support police accountability. There has been lack of a political commitment to police accountability. And the different politicians at different times talk about police accountability when they feel that there is need to talk about it in terms of how they feel impacted by the police. But when they're in power, they completely ignore the need to pronounce themselves on police accountability. We think that there is a need to introduce a legislation on how to handle street protests, how to restrain police officers and restrain different other units of the police during street protest. But I think the need for reforms go deeper into this. Yes, independent police oversight authority and the DPP can be empowered to strengthen accountability mechanism, but we feel also there is a greater need for using a sector-wide approach to police reforms in order to have a comprehensive impact on these particular reforms. Let's proceed on, please. With regard to devolution, we find quite a number of issues that are very important here. And we feel actually that in particular, police consensus matters in fostering accountability at the local level and as well at the national level. If the elites are in agreement on how to foster accountability, then that will not be difficult to do in their counties. Secondly, we find that inclusive politics is important. That is inclusion of elites and their various groups in political power arrangements in the counties. That's what prevents violence. That's what prevents instability in the counties. But ironically, it is this elite inclusive politics that undermines accountability itself, even at the national level. The more inclusive you are, the more limited you are in terms of how you can foster accountability, because many of the people you bring on board are people without interest on issues of accountability. Inclusive politics, we say this because inclusive politics, and the way we find it is that inclusive politics in our context of Kenya here tends to privilege representation rather than the quality of leadership and accountability. It's representation as an end in itself, right? Unfortunately, this is very different from the politics of the 1970s and 60s, where representation was actually combined with the question of leadership and accountability. And we feel that this privileging of representation is a very recent phenomena coming with regard to coming as a result of devolution. And I am saying that simply because devolution has also activated politics of identity and the belonging in the county level. I mean, in some counties, you'll hear people calling others guests, others being called owners. There is the concept of insiders and outsiders, depending on whether you are a native or whether you settled in the county fairly recently. Finally, devolution, because of its the amount of resources accompanying it, has resulted in the creation of new elites, the novel rich, that are very powerful and influential economically and politically in terms of controlling decisions. Now, it is these elites that are emerging that are responsible for fostering the wave of negotiated democracies that we saw in various counties in 2013. But then they are also responsible for undermining accountability in all its forms, because many of them get into devolution with a lot of self-interest. Our recommendation, if I can just only underline one thing, is the need to strengthen local accountability mechanisms in the counties, including building on citizens' oversight organizations. Community-based organizations will play an important role in this regard. There is a need, of course, to develop a framework for inclusive politics, but with, of course, with a lot of caution here, that even if there is a framework for inclusive politics, that framework must be accompanied by mechanisms that will foster accountability. Proceed on, please. What have been our key products and outcomes of this particular study? We feel that we indeed impact on the understanding of elections in Kenya, not only the 2017 elections, but we feel that we are contributing to understanding of politics in Kenya, especially politics that have resulted from devolution and the 2010 constitution. We also feel that we are improving on knowledge on institutional preparedness and the implications for conducting credible elections. And finally, we feel we have got a strong ground now to say that we are having new knowledge on the workings of devolution in the country, and especially how devolution is impacting on local level politics as well as the national level politics. And we say this simply because we did produce a special journal of the East African studies, that this is a high impact journal. I'm happy to say that the citations of many articles here has been very impressive in the last 1 year. Both the individual articles, our introduction, the journal itself, is being referenced to now and then on studies of electoral in the Eastern Africa region and across and in Kenya in particular. Individual authors have continued to publish various articles using the data from the project in various other journals. And again, I would say that these articles are also getting a lot of citation, which is a credible impact, if I can say that, because it really leads to understanding of politics and organizational politics in this part of the world. And finally, we did produce policy briefs that we shared with some of the institutions that we were paying attention to, and we also made presentations at different levels where we would invite people from various institutions to listen to some of our findings. So we feel that we did impact on organization of elections in this significant way, but most importantly in providing new opportunities to understand electoral politics in Kenya. Finally, what's next? What we have done is that we have continued, as I've said, we are continuing to publish using that data, and I think all of us academics were involved. Of course, this is what we do almost on a regular basis, but you'll find that we have used different outlets to publish some of the data that we came up with during this particular period. Some of it pay attention to electoral context, the role of institutions, how to promote political accountability, and so on. And we are teaming up again in a very different form all together, the same team somehow in different form again, to look at the 2022 elections. And we believe that the lessons learned from the 2017 elections will find their way into what we are doing at present, and in numerous other publications. The only thing I would say is that I think at the beginning of the project, given the nature of divisive Kenyan politics, it was we had a common understanding with the FCDO then, or DFID then, and the British High Commission then, that we needed to be careful how to cite the articles so that we do not say that it's funded by the British High Commission or FCDO or DFID because of the nature of the politics in Kenya. People would have misinterpreted this in different ways, but that's purely understandable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karuti. That was really, really interesting. We'll move very quickly on to the next presentation. We are running a bit behind, so if I could ask the presenters to really try and keep to the allotted time, that would be helpful. So over to Sue.
I was feeling guilty. Thank you.
No okay, can everyone hear me okay? Can everyone hear me okay? I'm going to assume yes. Okay, good morning everyone, and thanks very much for the opportunity to attend this event. It's really been fascinating, the first two presentations, so looking forward to the discussion. I'm Sue Griffiths. I'm the Managing Director of Social Development Direct, which is a UK organisation that works with partners around the world to improve the evidence base on gender inequality, social inclusion in a range of different areas. I'd just like to say at the outset that actually I'm presenting on behalf of a colleague who unfortunately can't be here today. So this work was completed in 2017, which is before I was at SD Direct. But as someone with a long history in working to advance women's political participation, I found the findings really interesting and really important. So this slide just sets the research into context, and I'd like to mention and refer to the robust evidence that now exists that higher proportions of women in politics result in better policy outcomes. And that's not just better policy outcomes for women, it's actually better outcomes for everyone. So we're talking about indicators like overall economic outcomes, levels of corruption, inequality, trust in government, and a whole range of other factors. So globally then there are really good reasons to promote women's political empowerment, but how we actually do that is very local in nature and very dependent on political factors in a country or a locality. But that hasn't always been acknowledged in research, despite moves towards, for instance, things like thinking and working politically and political economy analysis approaches. Sometimes the view has been historically that technical fixes can be applied without taking sufficient account of the local political conditions. So really that was the backdrop to the research as it was formulated back in 2017. Next slide, please. Just a quick slide on the methodology. Broadly, there were 3 stages. A comprehensive literature review, which looked at both academic and grey literature. Secondly, a mapping exercise to identify women operating in government at federal, regional and local levels. And then thirdly, a qualitative research process involving interviews and group workshops, which was conducted in 2016 and 2017. So there were a total of 60 interviews, 3 group workshops, including both women and men working in government, women leaders in civil society, business leaders, women in the security sector, religious leaders, clan leaders, and people like university students. So the study was designed primarily as an exploration of women's experiences, their lived experiences. So the team was very keen to use participative approaches to understand not only what people think and do in relation to women's political participation, but also why they think that, what their motivations are. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the findings were in 3 areas, but of course they are all interconnected. The first area is political representation and influence, and a very live discussion at the time of the research was the introduction of a 30% parliamentary gender quota, which raised significant comment. Globally, quotas are one of the most effective and reliable ways of increasing the number of women in institutions and reaching that critical mass that you really need for women to be able to work collectively together. But numerical representation doesn't always translate directly to influence. So women can still be underrepresented in positions of leadership within an institution, and it's really not seen as a silver bullet. Secondly, the importance of building a pipeline of good female political candidates was highlighted, and that can be supported through training and mentoring opportunities, which I'll come on to a bit more later. But the effect of training is also limited unless we address the question of political finance. Becoming an MP or an office holder of any kind is expensive in most countries around the world, and where men hold economic power, it acts as a significant limiting factor on women's participation. And finally, in that first area, safe spaces can really support women, offering solidarity and role modelling. The second area for our findings was in socio-cultural norms and expectations, and perhaps the most significant barrier cited by participants was that the main vehicle for politics in the country is clan identity. So both men and women describe that women are seen as unreliable representatives in the political arena because of their dual affiliation to both their father's and their husband's clan. The electoral system, which operates through the power sharing agreement, is very linked to clan affiliation, embedding that systematically. So suggestions were made about changing the electoral system, going towards a one person, one vote system. But again, a word of caution here, because of the socio-cultural effects of clan affiliation, whatever technical electoral system is used, you're likely to get that affiliation permeating whatever electoral system is adopted. So again, it's not just a question of a technical fix solving the problems entirely. The last 2 areas in that second cluster, the model of leadership culturally, as in many countries, is overwhelmingly male, and the reality is therefore that men will need to be enlisted in any effort to shift the power. And to counter male-dominated models of leadership, the media can be a really useful tool, as increasingly it is the main way that people consume their political information. The third main area for our findings was in activism and collective action. And the aim of many women's political empowerment programmes is for women to do what's described as realising their own assets. So many women have leadership and policy skills from previous experience, community work, civil society leadership, but they need to be able to be supported to transfer that into the political arena. So many of our participants described their personal histories of political activism, social activism, and a desire to maintain links with civil society, particularly where there are shared interests. But that was not straightforward. Participants highlighted that there is a fragmentation of women's organisations. Female politicians are not necessarily working well with those organisations. Efforts are dispersed. Things like the Women's Caucus in the Parliament had fallen out of use. It's not, I would like to say, that we want women to artificially agree on every political issue. Of course, women like men have a diversity of opinions, but where there is a common cause, fostering that collective action can really have a transformative effect. Next slide, please. So just briefly 4 recommendations. The first is to promote more inclusive institutions by embedding both the structural and institutional reforms like gender quotas, political finances, electoral system, but also the softer elements of inclusion. Participants talked about merit-based approaches to recruitment and promotion, for instance, and again reviving the Women's Caucus, providing safe spaces for women to be able to offer each other solidarity. Secondly, supporting a movement towards more transformative gender norm change in society through local actors who are already working to shift discriminatory norms. In the Somali context, that means that participants really wanted to engage with male leaders, including religious leaders, and with the media. Thirdly, fostering women's political leadership skills and capacity. Again, that can be through training and mentoring in skills like negotiation, influencing, consensus building, in addition to creating, again, these safe spaces for women to be able to experiment and fail in a safe environment. And finally, encouraging the coordination of locally led collective feminist action. So donors and partners should be encouraged to work with locally anchored organisations and to invest in efforts to bring them together around shared interests. Participants expressed that sometimes funding a series of smaller independent projects in the worst cases can contribute to a sense of competition between different organisations, whereas actually what we're aiming at is trying to bring organisations together. Last slide, please. So what's next? I couldn't finish without mentioning the impact of coronavirus, which is on all of our minds. And sadly, we know that the pandemic has had an unequal approach and has exacerbated existing inequalities, including for women and girls. And this only reinforces the importance of women's leadership in responding to the pandemic in a way that doesn't continue to reinforce those inequalities. And there's some interesting emerging evidence that countries led by women may have displayed a more effective early response to the pandemic. And we know that globally women are disproportionately involved in the response. 70% of health workers are women, first responders are more likely to be women, and women-led organisations have been really vital to an effective grassroots health response. So I just end by saying that the area of women's political empowerment will continue to be a really critical one, particularly in responding to the pandemic and in building back better. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks very much, Sue. Another great presentation there. Straight on to Marilyn then, on women as leaders in Kenya. Over to you, Marilyn. Marilyn Kamuru, we can't hear you. I don't know if you're trying to come in.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Hello. Yes, we can. Yes.
Hi.
Thanks.
I hadn't unmuted. Oh my gosh. Okay. Good morning again, and thank you very much. As I was saying, I am presenting on behalf of a team that conducted this research. Dr. Yolande Buka at Queen's University and Marie Berry at University of Denver, and Margaret Momanyi at University of Nairobi. So the four of us were the leads on this, and the project was managed by RVI. So we were examining the leadership and influence of women in politics in Kenya in light of the 2010 constitution. And this work was being done just before the second election, so just before the 2017 election. The framework that we chose to use was the Goetz and Hassim framework, which isolates and examines women's access, presence, and influence. And the objectives of the research study were to map the presence of women in the government, determine barriers and enablers to women's access to political and decision-making roles, and then discern the influence of women in government policy and development. In addition to an extensive literature review, we did more than 80 interviews, 24 focus groups, and used the very novel but not so successful telephone survey of about 120 women legislators. So the findings of the research: the Constitution of Kenya 2010 is the most significant enabler of women's increased participation in politics and leadership. Without this, we would be in a lot of trouble. With it, we're still in a lot of trouble, but yeah. And while the numbers of women have increased, their substantive influence while in office has decreased. So what this has meant is that for women, their positions without power. And this influence is constrained by structural factors. So these are not issues that are related to women themselves, but the structural nature in which these positions are being constructed and power is being exercised to deny women influence once they assume positions, that it is becoming harder and harder to deny them based on the law. Quotas are absolutely necessary to increase women's representation. Indeed, what really we're seeing, especially with the backlash against the increased number of women in office, is that without quotas, women would have a significantly more difficult time accessing leadership opportunities. However, the gender principle has not strengthened the women's movement around a shared agenda. In fact, what we're really seeing is a fracturing of the movement. Again, some of this is related to the backlash. And then we're seeing rising gender-based violence, especially for women in legislative positions and in public leadership. And this is an important and very significant finding, because while our politics do tend to be very violent, for men, the violence ends at election. For women, what we're seeing is that there is increasing intimidation, harassment once women are in office. And this is also having a chilling effect on women who are seeking political office. So fewer and fewer women are seeking positions, including appointive positions. Next slide, please. So outcomes. The mapping was actually extremely important. At the time we did it, and actually even now, as we approach the next election, there really is no comprehensive mapping of women in politics and in leadership, despite the fact that there is a constitutional quota, which would mean that, it would be important to actually know that these institutions have met their quota requirements. So we actually had to do an extensive amount of work pulling together data from IABC in terms of elective women, and the nominated women. You're often trying to make sure that these haven't changed because of changes within political parties. So that's a real gap, and this was one of the ways in which this report was extremely useful. However, it continues to show us that male dominance continues to be structurally sustained despite the law. And I think it's important to start flipping this rather than talking about inclusion. And it was interesting to hear Professor Kanyinga talk about representative, the focus on representation as an end in and of itself. Male structured dominance in institutions is a significant problem. And I think that's one of the ways in which we're seeing that representation in and of itself may not be very helpful for women as well. Women are just exhausted. Women in politics, especially those who've been in politics for more than one cycle, really expressed to us research fatigue and really dissatisfaction with the interventions that are currently in place for them. They really would prefer a shift from candidate training, so preparing women to run for office, to technical support, and more focus on structural impediments to women's access, whether it's campaign finance, political party support, to ensure that political parties are actually viable avenues for women to emerge as candidates. The other very important finding for us is that it's very important to disaggregate women. Differently situated women face different barriers, and we actually found that even in terms of access and influence, your access determines your influence in many respects. So women who were nominated had significantly less influence. In the very first cycle, women MCAs who were nominated to county assemblies were denied offices, they were denied any budgets. They were often publicly assaulted, even within government offices, while they were trying to do their work, and told that they had no one they represented. And so access determining influence means that it is extremely important that we do not see all women in political office, even if they're legislators, as the same. They have very different opportunities for influence, despite the fact that they might be present in the same institution. The nomination process is unequally implemented and may be backfiring on women. In some ways, political parties are weaponizing the quota so that they are choosing women who then are perceived as incompetent, undeserving, and that is backfiring on women. Obviously, the quotas, while necessary, are not sufficient to expand women's influence when in leadership. There is a culture that is emerging that is extremely hostile to women's leadership. And so while quotas are helpful, without a change in that political culture, women's influence is going to be significantly curtailed. And then I think this is a very important finding, especially in light of what we're seeing around the elections, the findings from the elections and going into the next election, the continued strategic importance of the judiciary. So it's 2021, despite the fact that there was an advisory opinion from the Supreme Court in 2012, the Kenyan Parliament has still refused to enact a law on women's representation in Parliament. In fact, the current Parliament, actually none of the parliaments, have ever been constitutionally compliant. And this is especially significant because it means we're going into the third election without any mechanism to realize women's representation rights as already provided in the Constitution. It also means that we're going into a constitutional amendment process with an unconstitutional parliament. So there's some really important and significant implications of the violations of women's rights on the general rule of law environment. Next slide. So what's next? As I said, this declining rule of law and erosion of constitutional authority and norms will have a significantly negative effect on women, broader than women, of course, but a study related to women. Both formally and informally, we're seeing a significant erosion of the gains made in the Constitution of Kenya 2010. And while there is a tendency to sort of speak about these as progressive, the reality is that we're really not seeing progressive. What we're really seeing is stagnation and reversal. And women's fatigue is really borne out, that there is a need for greater urgency in terms of the interventions, in terms of the language, in terms of the engagement around this issue. Women also have reflected on the fact that they need greater support in terms of exercising technical competence once they're in their positions of authority, again, to just try and fight against the backlash once they're in positions of authority. The fracturing and weakening of the women's movement is an important but necessary focus, I think programmatically. The research bears out that, strong women's movements are necessary to secure gains, and the fracturing that's come from the backlash is extremely concerning. Also, the weakening of institutions, the lack of inclusion of women who have traditionally supported women's rights work into positions where they would then have an influence on women's representation and other women's rights has meant that there's a real breakdown in that network. And then, as I mentioned, the increased violence against women in leadership and politics. And again, this goes back to the strategic importance of the judiciary, not just on constitutional compliance, but on GBV and women in politics specifically, creating a culture where there is accountability that is criminal and that has consequences that may try and really thwart what is becoming a political culture of violence and intimidation that is keeping women out. So actually women are opting out, and women are seeing the violence that's perpetrated against women in office. And so political office is not seen as protecting women against violence, whereas for men, it both protects them against violence and allows them to do various other things. And that's a dangerous emergence. There are some challenges we've also seen with some of the programs, the model, this he for she model with male champions. Important that we start to link those to actions rather than just titles. So the president was a he for she champion, the leader of majority was a he for she champion. Despite all of this, we've still seen very little progress, and I think that's an important thing. I think it's also telling us a little bit about the impact of research on driving actual behavioral change by policymakers. So, failure to implement the constitutional provisions on women's representation will continue to limit women's access, presence, and influence. It's also going to contribute to a largely unstable environment. We have seen that when it matters, women's rights and women's representation becomes an issue to fracture political alliances. The recent advisory opinion by the Chief Justice in September of 2020, that was despite the fact that women had approached the Chief Justice in 2017 for an advisory opinion. So these latent issues and fractures can emerge at other points and will often be used by actors who are not aligned to the women's movement, but to advance a different agenda. So there are important things to watch. Regular reporting and tracking compliance with implementation of the gender quota. Again, support to National Gender and Equality Commission, Office of the Attorney General, IEBC on ensuring this mapping, because without this mapping, then it's very difficult to ensure compliance. And then that obscurity is part of how non-compliance is facilitated. Political parties remain a very important area of intervention, support for women's progress within political parties, and support for women-led political parties. Those have been particularly helpful for some of the sort of strong women who've managed to maintain themselves in politics. So those remain a critical area of support. And then civic education and community engagement remains critical to protecting constitutional gains, but also creating an environment where women are more readily accepted as leaders, and women are able to freely exercise their aspirations. I believe that might be it. Yeah, so this we've continued to publish on this report, and it's been cited a fair amount. I think what is really important about this report, in my view, is that it tells us how critically important it is to listen to women. Women really are the canary in the coal mine. Women's rights violations are often indicators of things going wrong systemically. And if we can listen to that earlier and use that as an indicator of more generic concerns, that would be very important. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Marilyn. We haven't got very much time left at all, actually, for Q&A. Nikolai, I'll just invite you very quickly to give some high-level reflections, and then I'll ask a couple of questions from the chat. Thanks.
Thanks, Julie. So Julie's given me 1 minute, which I've never had 1 minute before, so I'm actually going to time it, see if it's possible. So I think, first of all, revealing. These pieces of research were extremely revealing, in that they showed the political economy and the systems behind some of these big problems we're trying to deal with, corruption, women in leadership, and the complexity of Kenyan elections. Absolutely brilliant. Record, they're really good for the record. If you look at some of these elections reports I was reading last night, they go all the way back over decades, but they're also extremely current, and they tell us exactly what happened during the last election, and we still use them. Relevance. During this research, we were getting briefings on a monthly basis. So as well as the final report, we also had a lot of input on how to approach the politics, the judiciary, the institutions at the time of the last election. And finally, does this really inform and influence? Is this practical? Yes, we now have a portfolio that focuses on women in politics, election security, how to work with the IBC more effectively this time, and a wider and more interesting approach to corruption in Kenya. So it's all informed our current portfolio. 10 seconds over. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Nikolai. All right, I'm going to quickly read out a few questions from the chat, and one for each of the presenters. So on the first one for Claudia, do you think the acceptance of petty corruption builds appetite for grand corruption? For Professor Karuti, we've got a question from Evans Kibet asking, considering that the general election is less than 18 months away, what do you make of the current level of preparedness of these independent institutions in relation to your findings? And then a final one to both the presenters on women in politics. They say that politics is a game of perception, and media really can help in shaping these perceptions about women in politics and leadership. It would be interesting to know what role the media can play in this. So let's go back to Claudia then for the first one on corruption.
Yes, thank you so much for this question. I mean, I think that definitely they are related. I don't know which direction the causality goes. It's probably just part of a complex system. But something that we did find coming up very regularly in the research is that people would justify their engagement in petty corruption with reference to what those at the top are doing. So perceptions and the experience that corruption is going on a grand scale definitely works to normalize and to frame the way that petty corruption is justified. Now, one other interesting insight was that people, normally speaking, make a distinction, and here we're talking about, people at the level of users of public services. They make a distinction between the petty corruption that is involved in giving a gift and giving a small bribe, getting favors from a provider, and the high-level corruption. So actually, the petty corruption is in many cases not even considered corruption, and even when it's considered corruption, it's assessed to be of a completely different nature as the corruption that goes on at the top. So it's a very complex question that you're asking, but I think that definitely there are links, and that what the acceptability, or at least the normalization of different types of corruption, including the normalization of impunity at the high level, definitely fits into the social acceptability of corruption. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Claudia. Professor Carito, I'll pass over to you for the answer to the second question. Just a 1 minute answer if you can, thanks.
1 minute, yes. How well are institutions prepared? Not at all. That's the answer, sorry. The reason I'm saying that is because everyone seems to be focused on BBI, Building Bridges Initiative, and the kind of processes that are there. IEBC is yet to be reconstituted. It has only 3 commissioners, and we know very well that a new law will come in place talking about how it needs to be reconstituted. The judiciary is not yet properly constituted, especially at the Supreme Court. They will have to have new judges at that level. Political parties are having their own crisis, and all of them are fragmenting in different ways. They are not yet settled. Registrar of Persons has not finished the process of even giving identity cards so that people can register for voter. Many of them have been able to access funding for voter education if it begins. So I would say that institutional-wise, we are not doing very well. There is another problem, if I can say that, and this is the last comment to make here. Given the fact that we are focused on BBI, or Building Bridges Initiative, we are likely to get some laws being enacted very late in the electoral cycle. That is not good for the country. That is not good for the country. So we are not very well prepared, if I can say that. I think FCDO seems to be much more prepared than our institutions, because they have rolled out some important election support programs compared to what we see from both the government and non-state actors, period. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much for your succinct answer. And then if I can come to Sue, and then directly to Marilyn for reflections on the final question, please.
Thanks very much. Yes, just really quickly, media, definitely a really crucial part of the picture, for good or bad. So media can be perpetuating these discriminatory stereotypes, or it can be helping women to build the profile that they will need to be successful in politics. One of the big problems is cost of accessing the media, or just being shut out of it. In a lot of countries, the media is owned by private interests, so it's not a question of being freely accessible to anyone. To a certain extent, social media is opening up new opportunities to think about media, use media more cheaply, more easily. So that's definitely an area for the future.
Brilliant. Marilyn, any reflections?
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that media is really part of the establishment. It's part of the structure that we're talking about. So it's very difficult for the media to, as just one arm, undo the structural disempowerment of women. And so ensuring that men remain sort of the preferred, the dominant, and overrepresented speakers on politics, on leadership, on governance, is an aspect of the media. And so media doesn't sit outside of the structures we're speaking about. And it's unable to really undo that in the same way. I do want to echo Susan about the role of social media, but what we're seeing about that is that that tends to be activism driven, and it is very, very powerful and important, but its influence is episodic. And so for long-term interventions, it's really not very helpful.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and definitely to our presenters for a really interesting set of presentations. It was really, really good. Just to say on the questions, I know we had to rush it a little bit at the end. If you have posted a question, we will aim to get we'll collate them and aim to get some answers back to you. And if you don't have to rush off, I believe there's a final video which you're welcome to stay on and watch for the next 3 minutes. Thanks very much to everyone. Bye.
Africa is evolving. 6 of the world's fastest growing economies in the last 10 years were in sub-Saharan Africa, and Africa as a continent has the most significant population growth in the world. Countries in East Africa face a myriad of challenges: a youthful population needing jobs, rapid urbanization with a growing slum population, climate change and pressures on livelihoods, particularly in the drylands, discoveries of oil and gas, alongside high levels of corruption and the risk of conflict. In addition, chronic poverty remains high, and the COVID-19 pandemic has compounded these problems and development challenges in the region. The UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office country offices, FCDO, and Africa regional teams are at the front line of delivering programs to improve the lives of poor and vulnerable people. With this is a need for context-specific evidence to inform FCDO's country programs and policies. Robust evidence on what works and what does not, as well as better data on context and need, is required to ensure the best impact and value for money for investments. To address this need, the East Africa Research Hub was established to provide support to country offices in the region through embedding regional advisors to guide the delivery of more contextualized research and evidence for development in the region. The Hub has been working across 8 African countries, including Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Somalia, and aiming to address issues such as economic development, climate change, humanitarian assistance, human development, governance, and conflict prevention. A regional funding mechanism to procure and manage a portfolio of research projects was also established. This portfolio was dubbed the East Africa Research Fund. The fund has been managed by PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, with its mandate covering 4 key areas. 1. Supporting country offices in the region to use and generate high-quality relevant research and evidence. 2. Supporting regional relevant research that addresses key challenges for countries in the region or cross-border issues. 3. Strengthening the research capacity and systems in East Africa. And 4. Promoting cross-UK government work on science, technology, and innovation. Overall, 38 research projects were commissioned. 21 projects were country-specific and 17 were of regional focus. The fund received over 500 research applications from international, regional, and local research suppliers whose investigations centered on their priority areas. Out of the 38, 29 projects were awarded to international organizations with a strong local presence and 9 to regional suppliers. Over the years, research organizations were engaged at the research design stage of different studies, which increased the participation of regional suppliers by 70%. This early engagement was instrumental in creating institutional partnerships and collaborations. Implementation of the various projects has resulted in the production of high-quality country and regionally relevant evidence products meeting demand from and priorities of FCDO country offices in East Africa. The fund leaves behind a firm legacy with visible capacity building pathways, strengthened research systems in the countries of operation, and most importantly, available, accessible, and high-quality contextualized findings on country-specific and regional research themes, public goods available to governments, donors, and relevant stakeholders to promote evidence-based policymaking in the region. As the fund closes, the Hub will continue delivering on research and evidence to support regional programming and policy, but will include a focus on promoting a science, technology, and innovation agenda in Africa through enhanced science diplomacy and partnerships. By supporting science, research, emerging technology, and digital innovations and capability, promoting the UK as a valued and key partner for Africa in support of economic growth, jobs, trade, and development in the region. By developing digital, technology, and innovation ecosystems and scaling them up through bespoke programs. By driving coherence and impact of science, technology, and innovation investments to support country priorities and in support of sustainable development and poverty alleviation, and by delivering more equitable and ambitious science, technology, and innovation partnerships between the UK and partner countries.